Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow pub crawl through my entire Penguin Classic collection, one book at a time, or at least one author at a time. And a couple of times now I have shown you multiple books from one author, like just recently Cicero, who has a vast amount of stuff that has survived from antiquity in excellent editions. And so Penguin Classic as a whole, as over the course of their time, made a whole shelf of various bits and pieces of Cicero. And our author today is an author who wrote at least as much as Cicero did, wrote and published at least as much as Cicero did, books on every conceivable subject and a vast amount of collected and annotated correspondence. Much like Cicero, only without the statesman posturing, without the political career. This was a full-time, devoted man of letters. Someone esteemed by all of his friends as a man of letters, as someone, a creature of his library, as a quiet, calm, careful scholar, which is not exactly the reputation that he has today, because, unlike Cicero, this particular author, who wrote hundreds of books, barely any survive. And ironically enough, one that does survive is one of the most popular works in the ancient world of them all, and that is The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius. Suetonius was born around AD 70, so he would have been a baby and a small child at the time of and in the immediate wake of absolute chaos in the Roman world, immediately following the assassination of Nero. But it also means that he would have come of age. He would have come into his adulthood and lived most of his adulthood. We know that he was still alive in AD 130, which means that he came of age, went to school, learned his letters and whatnot, embarked on a literary career during the period of the Spanish emperors, Trajan and Hadrian, and during the Antonines, the period of the Antonines, which Edward Gibbon famously describes as the best part, the best time to be a Roman. A time when, as another author put it, you could think what you like and write what you please. Not at all the norm in Roman history. And it shows in the career of Suetonius, because he wrote nonstop. He wrote books on every subject under the sun. From the intentionally salacious books designed to sell on the Janiculum, designed to sell in the book neighborhood of Rome, like The Lives of Famous Whores, to bigger and more studied things, like, for instance, the 12 Caesars. He also wrote a book on famous kings. He wrote tons and tons of books analyzing Rome itself. In the days of Suetonius, Rome, the capital, was already, and had been for quite some time, the focus of an actual tourist industry. That's how long clueless tourists in loud, tacky shorts have been trooping their way to Rome to look around. That's how long, and maybe even longer. Suetonius guessed correctly that there would be a market for books about the Roman calendar, Roman offices, Roman sites and traditions, and all that sort of stuff. And he wrote them all. And we don't have any of them, which is heartbreaking. We have most of, I would say probably 95% of the 12 Caesars. And we have a few of the lives that he wrote of famous authors, which are every bit as good. What I wouldn't give to have, well, of course, what I wouldn't give to have 13 volumes of Suetonius, like we have 13 volumes of Cicero, but what I wouldn't give, if I had to pick just one, what I wouldn't give to have the whole unabridged, completely clean lives of great writers and orators. What a thing that would be to have. How much light it would shed on so much. But we have the 12 Caesars, and it's the only thing that Penguin does. I can't remember. I should be able to remember this. Let me check and see here if maybe... No. Okay. Some editions, like for instance, I think Oxford World Classics will print the 12 Caesars and then all of the literary lives that we have as sort of an addendum. But Penguin doesn't do that. This is just the 12 Caesars. And there's a strong inference that can be drawn that Suetonius had unimpeded access to the official archives for at least the first couple of these lives, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. They read differently, thicker. more footnoted, if Romans footnoted, if you know what I mean. You get that feel of someone combing through archives that probably the author did not have equal access to for the rest of the lives. Not that he didn't still have access to a huge number of sources that we don't have anymore. Some of them we don't even have by name anymore. And Suetonius took a couple of liberties with the idea of writing history. In fact, I would say, goes a long way towards being one of the progenitors of a separate biography genre. And he takes a couple of liberties. One is that he dispenses to a large degree with strict chronology. He bounces all around depending on theme in the lives of his subjects. It doesn't, not completely billboarding, ping-ponging here and there, but he chases stories and themes wherever they take him. And the second thing that he does in this book is present his material with very little in the way of moralizing. There's behind the scenes, there's sotto voce moralizing, but he will, very much in the Herodotean manner, he will just present you with different accounts of something and weigh in maybe a little on what's reliable or not about each one of them. And that's up to you. It's up to you to decide on that. And unfortunately, a great many modern historians, and maybe not so modern, a great many historians in the last 300 years have forgotten that that is what Suetonius is doing, because Suetonius went on, this book survived. So it has gone on to become an ancient Roman source when actually it is retailing stuff that its author found from sources. And unfortunately, quite a few authors in let's call it by elastic terms, the present day, have forgotten that that's what Suetonius is doing, and just assume that if they find something in here, then he's presenting it as a fact, as something they found, for instance, in those imperial archives on the Capitoline Hill, on the gigantic marble repository that had house slaves to lead you around and docents to analyze the holdings for you. And that isn't true. And Suetonius makes no claims that it's true. So just because you find a story, I want to say to these modern historians, just because you find a story in Suetonius, and just because Suetonius was an ancient Roman, doesn't mean the story's true. Even Suetonius would tell you that, and does. So when you're reading these Lives of the Caesars, and oh boy, do I recommend it. Oh boy, do I ever. Yeah. Last time I recommended the letters of Cicero as just a surefire one-to-one way to knock all the intimidation out of ancient classics. There are a number of classics that will do that. The letters of Cicero, that's one ancient classic that will do that. You'll just be engrossed. You won't even remember that you're reading an ancient Rome. And when you're done, you'll feel really comfortable talking about a work of ancient Rome. Not at all the bill of sale that the ancient world usually gets. And Suetonius' 12 Caesars is, oh my God, another perfect example. Usually when people tell me I want to start reading not just about the ancient world, but literature written in the ancient world, but I have no idea where to start. It looks so intimidating. It used to be, in previous generations, schoolmasters would often recommend Julius Caesar, but I think they did that because they were thinking what would be the easiest Latin. But nobody thinks that way anymore, and nobody learns Latin anymore. So it wouldn't be Julius Caesar. I would never have recommended Julius Caesar anyway. We'll get to him. Oh, don't you worry. But with the 12 Caesars, it's right at the top. That it and the Secret History of Procopius are the two things that I recommend most often. It's not everybody who will fall in love with Livy the way my friend Deb did. That would be great. That would be a better world. I would be happier if that were true. But she fell in love with Livy right away. She realized right away the right way to read him, which is as a storyteller. She calls him Uncle Livy, and that's entirely true. And so I always want to recommend Livy when people ask me that question, but no, nothing beats the 12 Caesars. It's just so good. These are just so good. A little infuriating, especially when if you read broader or more deeply into some of the figures in here, you suddenly get a very different impression from the one that Suetonius is portraying. And you see in his approach was dump it all out on the page, write it up, weigh it a little, and then leave you to decide. That approach has been banished forever by the great German academicians of the early part of the 19th century, who basically created the way we do history now. And God bless them for doing it, because it's the right way to do it, which is that it's the historian's job not just to dump things on the page, but to analyze their probity. That's what a historian is for. Anybody can read stuff that's dumped on a page. And that once you've analyzed its probity, you craft a narrative from the most reliable sources. It sounds like a truism, as most of the intellectual gifts of the Germans of the early 19th century sound like truisms, but it wasn't always the way. The father of history, Herodotus, does not do that. And I don't object at all, but it can lead to people. For instance, you read the Suetonius' life of Tiberius Caesar. There was a lot of negative stuff. There was a lot of negative stuff. The life of Tiberius probably fell out after Suetonius had real close access to imperial archives, and it was about an emperor figure who was largely absent from the Roman world. He was away from the capital, and it was a Roman figure who was thin-skinned to criticism, but totally averse to censorship, and who let it be known to his cat's paws in the city, who had bigger fish to fry anyway. So you get the worst possible combination of gossip and freedom, and hence you get a life in the life of Tiberius that should be taken with a large amount of doubt. There's a large amount of reading between the lines that's necessary in that life. It's fresh on my mind because, not fresh on my mind, but it's emphasized to me because 20 years ago, something like that, a friend of mine asked me as a favor, just as a personal favor, to do an annotated translation of Suetonius' life of Tiberius. And I did. And that caused me to be delving deep, deep into the records that we have and the inferences that can be drawn from them in a way that doesn't lessen Suetonius' enjoyability at all, but it underscores what you must do if you're going at this actually caring about what specific details are true and which ones aren't. That you don't need to care about that to read Suetonius and love him. You don't at all need to do that. You can read this book and just love it. It is absolutely fantastic. But if you want to know, if you're reading him wanting to know where you should lay weight and where you shouldn't, you have to do a deep dive elsewhere in order to find out, unless you have a really well annotated edition. And that brings us to this Penguin Classic, which is really well annotated. And the reason for that is not the translator. The translator here, there, and everywhere, this is one of the most popular translations of any work to any other language in the 20th century, is by Robert Graves, the author of I, Claudius and Claudius the God, among many other books. He did a translation of Suetonius in an old-style way, a way that translators, at least in their translators' prefaces, never admit to doing anymore. I would bet that a lot of them do, at least for stretches, but they don't admit it anymore, whereas it used to be freely admitted by these people who by figures like Graves or Aubrey de Selincourt, who had classical educations but weren't themselves any more professional classicists. And that way was, you take a passage from Suetonius, let's say, there's a long paragraph in the life of Augustus about how Augustus liked to consider himself a normal person, a person of the field, a farmer. He inculcated into his language rustic sayings that really didn't make sense. They weren't actually taken very closely from the actual rustic sayings out in the Roman countryside. They were designed to make him sound like a normal person. They actually made him sound even more odd than usual, and he had total power over the Roman world and total power of life and death over everyone in it. It's impossible to make someone like that normal. You need look no further than the Mark Zuckerberg congressional testimony that is lampooned endlessly on YouTube in clips to see that once you have a squintillion $1 million and power over hundreds of millions of people, you are effectively a space alien. And Augustus knew that, and he fought against it with these rusticisms. And there's a long paragraph in Suetonius' Life of Augustus where he details some of those, and the nature of them, and the way they came out in conversation, how Augustus used them. And what Robert Graves would do would be to take that passage, read it in the best Latin edition that we have, and then hold it in your mind and move it around while you're out walking the dogs, or while you're out walking in the field, or while you're walking along the seashore. And then when you come back, sit down and write it out, but without having the Latin at your elbow, without doing that. Instead, you have processed that paragraph and you are now going to write it out in English. You might check back with the Latin to make sure that no specific detail is missing. But the flow, the conversational feel, the sense of it will be entirely you. It won't be Suetonius. And you just do that for the whole work. That's how we're going to get to Livy, believe you me. And Albert de Selcourt translated the chunks of Livy that he translated, he did basically that way. Lots of classicists have done that. And I don't begrudge it at all. But it does obviously, as you can tell, it does lead to variances with the text. Let's put it that way. It can start to read more like Robert Graves than like Suetonius, which is interesting in its own right, but maybe isn't what you want when you go to an edition. And the editors at Penguin Classics sort of knew that, and they got Michael Grant. We've seen him as a translator in previous Penguin Classics. He was in the 20th century, he was a popularizer and a popular translator and classicist, and a little bit of an unsung figure in my mind. He's ubiquitous. In the 20th century, he was ubiquitous in the classical world. Translations, classical editions, histories, lots and lots of books to his credit. But not enough credit, I think. And this volume really shows it, because the editors at Penguin Classic got Michael Grant to look over the Robert Graves Suetonius. They weren't going to get rid of Robert Graves as a translation, because it's just fine, and also because it doesn't hurt to have Robert Graves' name on your book. Not now, it doesn't matter, but once upon a time he was this austere and hot property name. Not out of any kind of disrespect, but because, as Michael Grant puts it in his brief introduction here, just to clean it up, just to tighten it up here and there, and put in footnotes where Graves wouldn't have crossed Graves' mind to explain or to put a footnote or anything like that. Graves would often just incorporate the footnotes into the version of that paragraph that he ended up writing. So if Suetonius makes mention of the length of a Roman week, for instance, and which particular day on that week was typically set aside by omens or by tradition for a certain activity, Graves, instead of just translating what Suetonius writes and putting a footnote to explain it, would explain it as if Suetonius were including the explanation himself. I don't think that does violence. I look at translations all the time in reference to whether or not the original author would object if they could read it. And I think that Suetonius would be the first. He was a working writer, for Pete's sake. He would be the first person to look at the things like that Robert Graves did and say, yes, absolutely, you're not hurting my meaning at all. Yeah, absolutely. Footnotes are distracting. If you can easily do this in the normal walking pace of my prose, then go right ahead. And that's what Graves does a lot of times throughout this book, more often than not. And what Michael Grant does in a marvelously tactful editing job is to go through and sort of pin those down a little more and let you know when he's not pinning them down. It's a masterful job. So although there are far more extensively annotated editions of this work in other editions, I think the Oxford World Classics edition is, in terms of critical apparatus, makes this look embarrassingly underdressed. But even so, I would recommend this version more than I would any other. I'm hoping, I haven't checked. I really need to get into the habit of checking the current state of Penguin Classics when I do these, the old chestnuts from the ancient world. But I'm really hoping, I would really hope that Penguin Classics, that their current pretty trade paperback edition of Suetonius is still the Robert Graves. I would really hope that that's the case. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It deserves to last. But anyway, that is our Daily Penguin for today, an ancient historian that I can strongly recommend to anybody. That's going to be a comparative rarity when talking about the ancient world. Certainly, I wouldn't recommend The City of God by St. Augustine to anyone. But this one, it'll bring you right into the ancient world. It's full of personalities, full of great walk-on bit parts, and in Robert Graves' hand, it is transformed. Suetonius could be a little bit of a stilted storyteller. Graves actually improves the rhythm of how he tells his stories just a bit by moving it into idiomatic English. So in terms of an ancient author who I can heartily recommend, Suetonius is one of them. And in terms of an edition, I would recommend this, if you can find it. The Michael Grant neatening up and tightening up of the Robert Graves translation of Suetonius will do you just fine. And then when you're done, you will not only have read an ancient Roman author, you'll have loved one. That'll go a long way toward taking the intimidation off everybody else. But anyway, that's your Daily Penguin for today, and we will press on tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.